All right, welcome back to another CM 101 series. Last week we talked about the mind structure from a sort of Zen Chinese medicine understanding. This week we're going to be talking about the 8 layers of consciousness, more from the strictly Taoist understanding. Zen, Taoism, Buddhism, they all intermingle together. This is more from the mountains and Taoism kind of view. So let's have a look into it. So that's the Zen, what we talked about last week, the mind structure. Now, this is what we're going to be getting into this week. Beautiful. So, important to understand. So, this is different to Timothy Leary's 8 circuits of consciousness. This is different. So, it's not 8 levels of the mind, it's 8 layers of consciousness. So, the first 5 levels are receptors: our sight, our hearing, our smell, our taste, and our tactile. So, our receptors see something, and then that image or that smell gets processed and sent down to thought consciousness. So the first 5 layers are receptors, or similar to gatherers, which we talked about last week, and they're what we call individual wheels. Just like a car couldn't move if it only had wheels, it's the same thing. They're just a part. So after our receptors, we have thought consciousness. Thought consciousness takes in the data from the 5 senses, it processes it, and it reacts. So you can see how that's similar to what we talked about last week with the intellect. So the thought consciousness is the boss of the first 5 layers of consciousness. It can be seen as a train of wheels. So now we have a system which can function somewhat and move. So most people actually function from this thought consciousness. There isn't much more happening because it's just a train of wheels, it's parts moving together, and there's not much else introduced into the system to make it function optimally. So yeah, the thought consciousness is a train of wheels because it allows the system to move and be dynamic and be alive. So after thought consciousness, we have ego consciousness or mind consciousness. And this takes in thought consciousness. And the other way we can look at ego consciousness and mind consciousness is as a 2-headed snake. So we have one head of the snake here attaching to thought consciousness, and then we have another head of the snake here attaching to base consciousness. And this is actually where the bottleneck is for most people. Most people are choosing to listen to the snake connected to thought consciousness, which is correlated with our upbringing, our environment, our externalities, rather than tapping into the base consciousness. And that's the thing which is holding them back. So this we call water wheels. So you can almost think of it like, when you have a dam or you have a river and you have that wheel coming around, forget what it's called, pushing the water, making the current move. That's what we can think of as ego consciousness. So it's pushing the water upstream. Then we have base consciousness and seed consciousness. So all other 7 consciousnesses arise from here. So it's the originator. Current flows upward. So all other 7 layers of consciousness are what we call processed or transformed consciousness, all coming from here. So this can be a good reference point actually for helping to experience the process of reversal. Now, process of reversal is something which every effective tradition talks about in meditation or the highest levels of religion or Carl Jung, all talking about this process of reversal. And what it is to help one's mind come back to the origination and the source of all things, below all the clutter and the instability and chaos of the mind and our relationships and everything else. So this is where life's good. So we've all seen that. That's where the 1 goes into the 2, 2 goes into the 3. So we've got the non-duality, then we've got yin and yang, fear and love, then we've got the heaven, man, earth, then we've got 5 organs, 5 elements, and then that all gets separated down into our emotions and 10,000 things. But we've all seen that before. So, properties of layers, contemplation. So actually all layers of consciousness has the ability to contemplate. Even, as you can see here, got a big bracket saying, even the receptors, our senses, have the ability to contemplate. Now, this is something which when I started reading this a little while ago, I was like, this makes so much sense, because when I was in meditation, I would always have this thing in the back of my mind going, man, my mind's not still. And at the time I was like, actually, no, I think my mind is still more or less. And what I was actually taking in, thinking it wasn't stillness, well, sort of still isn't, was my senses giving me data because they can contemplate. But the important thing is that even though sight, for example, has the ability of contemplation, it's not stationary contemplation, meaning it's transitory, it lasts temporarily. So if I look at a mountain, my eyes have the ability to contemplate that, but that's it. That's all they can do. And then they send that data to thought consciousness. But it's cool because you wouldn't normally think that even your receptors have the ability to contemplate. So after contemplation, unlike the first 5 layers, thought consciousness also has the ability to discriminate what it's taking in. It takes in that data, then it can start to process and form analysis and concepts. So it's doing it from there. So this is our sensory level, this is our intellectual level, the yes and no of our preferences, and then it sends this down to ego consciousness. So you can see here that thought consciousness is the manager or master of our first 5 layers of consciousness. They are at the bidding of our thought consciousness. But thought consciousness is at the bidding of ego consciousness because that's its headmaster. And yes, you guessed it, base consciousness is actually the real master of all of them. So this is the ocean, the water itself. Then upwards comes to the ego consciousness. The water moves that current so it flows even further up. Then we have that water continuing to flow upwards, creating more ripples, which then is attached to our receptors. We'll talk about more of that in a second because it doesn't really make sense the first time you hear it. So this is what we've got here. So why I was saying is it's different to the normal approach of how reality functions is because the brain generated view of reality says that, okay, yep, you take in senses, yep, gets processed through your brain and it gets this signal, then we have the ability to reflect and then blah, 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 and then you have the subconscious. Similar to what we talked about, but actually the Chinese medicine point of view is the brain doesn't generate consciousness. Consciousness is the universal phenomenon which everything gives rise to. So our brain is actually codependent of anything in the outside world. So I'm smelling or I'm looking at a tree right now outside my window, but it's only possible for that tree to exist because my brain is perceiving it at the same time. They're both codependent of one another. Doesn't mean just my brain specifically, but a brain is already a collapse of consciousness, meaning before reality forms, well, at the base of all reality is consciousness. It's a non-local network. But our mind gets tricked into identifying with our brain that our brain is creating things and then seeing something. But in actual fact, it's happening at the same time, which is why connecting to base consciousness is so important. I'll say a little bit about that in a second. But going back to this, the bottleneck for most people is this right here, this area, because they are choosing the snake, which is connect to thought consciousness, which means you're going to be living your life and your personality in a way which is dependent on everything you've seen, everything you've heard, or who your relationships are, what your upbringing was, etc., etc. I'd say about most people on the planet probably living through thought consciousness, the snake of the thought consciousness, maybe 90%, that head. And only like about 10% of base consciousness. And that's why you can't see much change. That's why you get over-identified with ideals and beliefs and politics. I'm not saying that life's all about just pretending your consciousness, but if you understand that consciousness is what gives rise to everything, it's not like you won't ever have arguments, but at least you might be able to find space to go, hey, yeah, we're here to be human. We're here to have preferences and ideas and to engage in particular ideologies because that's what we are, we're human. But sometimes, even if we don't have to understand completely that we're consciousness and all this is the superficial layers, which is just feeding from that, maybe at least sometimes we don't need to, or we can take a break and separate ourselves from understanding that thing we identify with is not so important because it's not really us. So the bottleneck of the life is for most people to move away from the snake, which is attached to our thought consciousness coming from our senses and our thinking and our preferences, and moving more towards base consciousness, more towards the layer which precedes all the instability, all the chaos, all the hecticness with our relationships, all this how we think about life, and is this good or if it's bad, are we doing well? Base consciousness is what underlies all of that. It's where the good shit is. So, bit of a summary. First 5 layers are our receptors and they're contemplative. So they're gathering all our data, just like the gatherers from last week. Then they send it to thought consciousness, which takes in the data and it can begin to discriminate, form our preferences and form our ideas. Then that gets sent down to ego consciousness, which is its master, and that's a 2-headed snake which connects to both the earlier layers of consciousness and to base consciousness, which is everything happening all at the same time, all together. So, sorry, I misspoke there, but basically, awareness of base connection is super vital. I've written that there because if everything is all happening at the same time and your brain is codependent of everything else in the external world, then that means fundamentally underneath everything there's something much, much, much deeper. And the more you begin to connect to that thing, which is the base of all reality, the less all this stuff will begin to affect you. And then the better all that stuff can begin to function, paradoxically. So we've talked about the mind structure last week. The 10,000 things is sort of very relevant to this too. And then we're talking about this from another angle. And then next week we'll be talking about the 10 levels of the mind. Talk about the mind structure. This is the 8 layers of the mind. Then we'll be talking about the 10 levels of the mind. And all these things aren't necessarily concrete concepts and structures, which are 100% true. They're all ways to conceptualize the process of what's happening in your mind and in your consciousness and in reality, and becoming aware of them. When you do become aware of them, how much better it makes life flow. So do with this information what you will. Probably only 10 people are going to watch it anyway, doesn't matter. And that is the 8 layers of consciousness.